and hand it over to Gabriel.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you for all the attendees that joined us to the webinar of Environmental Social Responsibility Society. Today, the topic today is climate change, and we want to talk about how the mining sector has improved and implemented new technology looking for energy efficiency and reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. How the sector, at the same time, is a key partner in the production of commodities that is required in a clean energy technologies and supporting the reduction of and to move forward to a lower carbon future. So today we have Graham Winkelman, our guest speaker. Graham is a practice lead climate change at BHP Billiton, based in Melbourne, but he is right now in Regina in Canada. Thank you, Graham, for being here. Where in BHP, he is a global role, covers BHP response to climate change and energy policy and leadership of carbon capture and storage initiatives. Graham represents BHP Billiton through a number of high-profile orgs, including the International Council of Mining and Metals, the International Emissions Trading Association, and the World Bank's Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. Today, Graham is going to share a webinar talking about driving sustainability through strategic partnerships. Welcome, Graham, and please, you can start to show us your presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Gabriel, and thank you, everybody, for the opportunity to speak today. I hope I'm coming through clearly. I hope that my accent isn't too difficult for people to understand, and looking forward to probably spending the next 30 or 40 minutes, I would think, on my presentation, but then very keen to hear feedback, understand any questions or queries that you might have, or if I can make anything clearer, I'd be very, very happy to do that. I've got a presentation. It's probably about 35 slides long, but some of those slides I'm pretty sure we can move through a bit more quickly than others. So look, as Gabriel said, my name is Graham. I work for BHP, based in our head office in Melbourne, Australia, and my role is within our sustainability and public policy team. And a lot of my role is spent across various aspects of our climate policy. I think for the last, since the last 20 or 25 years, BHP has had an articulated policy on climate change and a way of engaging on climate change that recognises the reality of climate change, but also articulates the actions that we take to manage the risk that we see for our business going forward. A lot of my time is spent on the policy side, so I spend a lot of time globally on climate policy. Primarily that's associated with understanding impact of current regulation, but also engaged with industry associations, with governments, policymakers, institutions on what we think good policy looks like in the space of climate change. And I think it's fair to say that over the years, climate policy probably hasn't quite kept up with where we might think the expectations should have been over that period of time, and we're keen to advocate for the things that we believe are, in principle, proper and right to have built within climate policy. I spent a bit of time also on some of our longer term product stewardship and Scope 3 emissions issues as a company. We recognise the stewardship role that we have within our products. We do have fossil fuels in our products, carbon intensive products, and from a climate change perspective, that provides us a unique challenge, but also a unique opportunity as well to manage that risk. So that's where I spend most of my time, but my colleagues in the small team that we're in spend time setting our targets. They spend time looking at our adaptation response to climate change. They think about portfolio health for the company in relation to a world that addresses the risk of climate change. And so we're quite a diverse group within the 4 or 5 people within the team. And obviously, as you would expect, we have strong and enduring links to other parts of the business, because we're a company that is globally distributed, that has 60,000 employees, and activity in support of our strategy on climate change that's relevant and present in all of our operating regions. So that's an introduction to myself. I'll just start sharing my screen, and please let me know if that's not happening. You should be able to see the screen now. Have I had success there, Gabriel?
Yeah, that's
great. Okay. And I've chosen to put the word partnerships into the title here because I think that without partnerships, and it's just an emphasis that I wanted to make in this discussion, without partnerships, I think a lot of what we try to do in sustainability and climate change is actually very difficult. And so we always seek strong partners. We carefully select strong partners to help us achieve the type of goals that we want to achieve, as well as providing the leadership that we can provide to partners that we work with so that we can mutually learn as we go forward. But as I've said, BHP, Global Resources Company, we have a purpose that's been articulated in this fashion for a number of years, and that is to create long-term shareholder value through discovery, acquisition, development, and marketing of natural resources. But I think to bring that to life, it's worth understanding the spread and the variety of products that we provide as a company. We describe ourselves with 4 main pillars as a company. Petroleum, so mostly conventional oil, and up until more recently, unconventional gas. I wouldn't call us an oil major, but we are significant and one of the larger oil producers in the Gulf of Mexico. Iron ore, a very significant part of our business, almost entirely located in regard to footprint in our Western Australian operations in Australia. Copper, overwhelmingly overrepresented in Chile, in our northern Chile copper mines, Escondida, Spence. Escondida being one of the world's largest copper mine, and we manage that in a joint venture with Rio Tinto and several other partners. And then coal. The vast majority, again, of that coal is metallurgical coal, so it's a type of coal, as you would know, that is used in steel making. And I believe we are still the world's largest exporter of metallurgical coal, primarily coming out of our Queensland operations, again, in Australia. We have a charter for our business, and I always like to talk about this charter when I engage externally because it's probably the most important document in the company, and that is it describes how we view our values, how we regard our values, and it's not for us a document we gloss over. We are obligated in the things that we do, in the activities that we undertake, in the programs that we run, to reflect on the values that we have set as a company and to embody those in the way that we deliver those strategies. The values range from sustainability, integrity, and respect through to high performance, simplicity, and accountability. What I hope, and this is something I challenge the team and myself on, is ensuring that we see these values reflected in the way that we deal with climate change. Very specifically on that topic, sustainability is obviously linked to the way that we think about climate change, but as are all the other values that we embody as a company. And it's we're not paying lip service to those values. We want them to be evident in the way that we engage. So our approach to climate change, we know that this is an important topic, but it's more than that. Our board knows that this is an important topic. This is a topic that is discussed at board level, dedicated discussions, impact, strategy, and plans to go forward are agreed by the board when those plans are material enough to reach that level. But climate change as a topic is something that is, and deservedly so, gets that recognition at board level as one of the most important issues for the company going forward. We still say that we accept the IPCC's assessment of climate change science. I wonder if over time we need to drop that, because I think it's a given. The IPCC is a highly respected body. We should be accepting the IPCC's findings. Obviously challenged. They're obviously challenging themselves with all the work that they do to find best outcomes from a modelling perspective and from a predictive capability perspective on how climate change will play out over time. Part of our strategy is how we think about the twin objective. So this is about climate change, but also giving communities, giving economies access to reliable, affordable energy and materials. And we don't prioritise between those two, if you like. We think that both are achievable within the same strategy. And when I think about our actions to manage the risk of climate change, we typically discuss and talk about 5 different buckets of activity. And I'll talk about these in a bit more detail as we go through the presentation. I won't dwell too long on them here, but I just want to call them out individually so that we can work our way through these through the presentation. Reducing our emissions, so setting targets for our company. We've done that for a long time. We continue to do that, and that holds us accountable. It's also a very visual way to help us communicate externally why and how we go about prioritising climate change as an issue. Reducing our emissions is a priority. We work in partnership to accelerate the development and deployment of low emissions and renewable technologies. And I'll go into a bit more detail around that. I've got a technical background myself. That's how I came to this role as an engineer. And I have an enduring belief in the role that technology can play to reduce emissions and to through numerous available pathways, find a solution to the issue of climate change. Mind you, technology doesn't do it all. We have a lot of work to do on the policy side. We have a lot of work to do on the regulatory and the investor side as well. We adapt to the physical impacts of climate change. We know that that's already happening, and we have plans in place to do that. We test and build the resilience of our portfolio. So in a world that acts on climate change, how does our company manage that transition? And many of you who are associated with companies that are reporting through the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, the TCFD, will recognise the role of scenario testing in resilience for portfolio. And we work with others to enhance the global response. And this is a bit of a catch-all bucket that describes how we work with policymakers, how we work with institutions, global institutions, national and regional institutions, communities, our peer companies, to drive a response to climate change. So let me start with mitigation. So we've been setting targets for close to 20 years now, and our current target is to keep operational emissions below what they were in 2017 in the year 2022. We're a company that seeks to grow, and so that's challenging in that type of environment. We do reserve the strategy to use carbon offsets to reach our target. We've said that in the way that we've articulated our target, but we certainly have plans and strategies in place to find that internal abatement as we go forward. For the first time back in 2017, when we set this target, we set a long-term target. And that's the first time the company had set a long-term target. And I think it reflects a trend that we've seen. I wouldn't say so much in the resources sector, but we've certainly seen that trend in other sectors of setting long-term absolute emissions reduction targets. And we've set a net zero target in language consistent with the Paris Agreement, which is in the second half of the century. I'd like to see that number be more clearly articulated. One of the things that, and I think you can appreciate this, that is a challenge in this space is seeking to understand with more detail the technology pathways that will get us to that point of net zero. There's been such a revolution, if you like, in technology available to reduce emissions. Still challenges remain, but seeking to understand in more detail how those technology pathways play out is going to be important for us as we set our long-term target and refine that long-term target going forward. Second point was investing in low emissions technology. And I have a number of slides on this. So we're developing, as I just said in that previous slide, that pathway to net zero emissions for our long life assets. And that requires a lot of planning, long-term planning. And we want to develop emerging and deploy existing technologies to make those step changes to get there. And we're working on a suite of activities to do that. And I'll take you through some of those now. Zero carbon electricity supply over the longer term. We know that emissions already now from our electricity provision, either purchased as Scope 2 emissions, if you like, through the electricity that we purchase on contract, as well as electricity that we generate ourselves. We have gas-fired power stations. 46% of our total emissions come from power generation. And we recognise that that's a significant part of our emissions profile, and we have we seek to understand how technologies can reduce that as we go forward, and we're very, very deliberate about that. Zero carbon material movement. The next largest category for us is how we move material around. Primarily and predominantly, that is by large haul trucks using diesel and diesel liquid fuels. 35% of our emissions come from driving trucks, effectively, and accelerating technology in that space has challenges. We know that there is not the market-ready alternatives to that. We know that over the long term, a range of options may present themselves, whether that's lower emissions fuels like LNG, hydrogen potentially, electric motive power, electrification, so the greater use of conveyors, in-pit crushing, trolley assist. There's a whole range of potential options that might come into it, the way that we think about zero carbon material movement as we go forward. And the third category is fugitive methane emissions. Now, this comes predominantly from our coal operations in Queensland. There is some amount also associated with our oil activities, mostly in the Gulf of Mexico. We, until recently, held assets in North America of onshore unconventional gas, so shale assets, which made up a number of our fugitive methane emissions as well, but we no longer hold that as part of our portfolio. That presents another unique set of challenges, I think, abating fugitive methane in the unconventional gas sector, in the same way that the coal sector presents challenges for us here in Australia. Several years ago now, we elected to participate in a project called the Lakeland Solar and Storage Project in Queensland. So we didn't build the project, but we joined the project as knowledge sharing partners to become integral members of a learning group that sought to leverage the outcomes of this really unique project. Unique at the time. At the time, it was the largest combination of solar plus storage in the country, in Australia, and its location made it really interesting for us. We're a company with remote operations, and what that means is that when you're in a remote location, bearing in mind that most of our assets are connected to the grid at that point in the network has sometimes issues around stability. And they call that the fringe of grid issues. And these types of projects, which is at a fringe of grid location, sought deliberately to understand how it would interact in those locations, which presents challenges. Some of the lessons learned out of that project have helped us understand how these types of projects might assist companies like us and others in our sector in the future. So this extensive test program that we've been involved with has provided us insight that we can actually use and monetize within our own business, but also share those outcomes to others that might be interested. The next slide talks about light electric vehicles. So we have 2 trials running at the moment, actually, on deploying light electric vehicles at our operations. One at our copper operation in Australia, South Australia, Olympic Dam, and one at our coal operations in Queensland. So this is mature technology. We can all buy a Tesla, we can go out and buy an electric vehicle. But what makes it challenging in the mining environment is how it integrates. How's the charging infrastructure built? How are the cycle times built into the way that these vehicles are used? These are not mining vehicles per se, they are light vehicles, but they still have duty cycles that need to be incorporated in the way that they're managed, and integrating demands on these types of vehicles with a different arrangement for powering and moving and providing energy to these vehicles is something that needs to happen. And our people need to understand how to use these vehicles as well, and how to integrate them into their operations. And so it's been really useful for us to do this. We think this de-risks a further move towards electric vehicles across our operations over time. I'm also aware that you would be more familiar with this than I am, I'm sure, but in Canada, it predominantly, if not entirely, going forward, electric vehicles in underground locations to avoid issues of things like diesel particulate matter and other things. So we can see a broader trend towards electric vehicles for both health reasons as well as environmental performance. Carbon capture and storage. So this is something that we believe has an important contribution to make, whether that's the view of the IPCC, the view of the International Energy Agency, our own view. I think the climate challenge is very large. I think there's a huge amount that we can do across so many different technologies, and one of those is going to be carbon capture and storage. I think it's going to find application in areas like industrial application, steel making, cement making, natural gas processing. There's a range of applications where, to reach the type of outcomes that the world has committed to out of Paris, and the recommendations of the 1.5 degree IPCC report that you would be familiar with, that came out, I think, in November last year, we're going to have to try and bring these technologies to market a bit quicker than what they're coming to market at this point in time. And so back in 2016, we partnered with a project you're probably familiar with, the SaskPower Boundary Dam project in Saskatchewan. Now, our association with this project was not only because we thought this was such a unique project, in the sense it was the first in the world to be a CCS project fitted to a power station. We actually thought that the lessons learned out of this project would be the type of thing that would accelerate CCS in other areas. There have been some great successes as part of this project. There have been some lessons learned and ways that things might have been done differently. And I think that's rich. That's very, very rich learnings that can come out of these types of projects. And what we are interested in doing is capturing those outcomes, capturing those learnings, and making sure that they are available to a global audience, so that as projects progress in other sectors, in other areas, in other jurisdictions, other countries, that solutions will be brought to market quicker than they might otherwise have been, because of the lessons learned when going to a second or a third of a kind. The Knowledge Centres had fantastic engagement internationally, in China, in Europe, in the US, providing services, providing advice on pre-feasibility studies, on feasibility studies, on construction, on the development of projects globally, and we're pleased with the way that's gone, because what that is doing is it's bringing into a broader stakeholder set important lessons that we think need to be distributed more globally. I mentioned some of the activity that the International CCS Knowledge Centre has in China. Back in 2017, Mike, our CEO, in the Knowledge Centre, joined the Environment Minister for Canada on a visit where a number of things progressed. And there's a quote there by Catherine McKenna. I don't need to read it, but there's some great Canadian expertise in this space that is going to be useful and is going to be interesting and powerful to others that are seeking to implement these types of projects globally. And I think that's a great contribution that as a community we can make. I talked about the steel sector and CCS. I want to sort of dwell on this just a little bit. Two of our products, iron ore and metallurgical coal, are implicated in steelmaking. Steelmaking represents 7 or 8% of global emissions. very, very big number as a single industry, a very big number. And a lot of that is in China plus Japan plus Korea, and China being 50% of global steel production. A lot of our products end up in China, and we saw for ourselves an opportunity to engage in a discussion around low emissions technology for the steel sector in China. What role could we play as the suppliers of material to manage carbon risk across the supply chain to our customers, to think about what the future might look like from a low emissions technology perspective for the steel sector. There are a number of solutions that can be brought to reduce emissions in the steel sector. Some are further away than others, some are closer than others. What we do know is that the steel sector itself has done a lot of work around becoming more efficient. Some of the best energy efficiency engineers in the world, I think, work for steel companies. They have become very, very good at what they do. But to make a step change to reach the type of goals that the Paris Agreement has articulated will take more than energy efficiency. It's going to take something else to do that. It's going to take technology change. And that technology change will either come in the form of carbon capture and storage. It could come in the form of hydrogen as a reductant. It could come in the form of electrolysis for iron ore. And it will definitely come in the form of enhanced recycling of steel back into the supply chain. I spent a bit of time in Japan as part of my role, and it's interesting to see the steel sector there and what they are doing. They've set for themselves a goal by 2030 to develop the commercial technology necessary to deliver about a 30% reduction in the emissions intensity of making steel by a combination of carbon capture and hydrogen. When I speak to others around the world, I think I always come back to the Japanese example. As an integrated, industry-wide, medium to long-term strategy for decarbonising their own sector. And I think they've done a tremendous job of doing that. In China, I'd say there's an emerging conversation, but probably less mature than the Japanese conversation around decarbonisation of the steel sector. CCS is going to be important for them, and so we've been discussing with a range of partners there, including Peking University and the National Centre for Climate Change Strategy and International Cooperation, on what role CCS plus other technologies might play in their sector. We've been doing that for a couple of years. We're working with technical teams at Peking University, with financial and economic teams at the Guanghua School of Management at Peking University, and working with policy experts at the National Centre for Climate Change Strategy. That work is due to wrap up in about a year and a half, and as we've gone forward, we've set a pattern for sharing information. This is an example of one of the symposiums that we held in Beijing. I think this was last year, maybe the year before, on trying to communicate the results and the outcomes of the work that we've been doing. We attract a wide range of attendees, a lot of industry folk, academics, government and institutions come along to, and as has been told to me, the first time that these stakeholders have been brought together to talk about this really important topic of emissions reduction in the steel sector. No doubt those conversations have been going on in different parts of the economy in China, but to bring these groups together into one room and to have a discussion around the pace of change, the technology options, and how to move forward has been a fascinating opportunity for us to be involved in. We very, very recently, only a matter of weeks ago, really, months ago, took an equity position in carbon engineering, which is, again, a relevant Canadian technology, actually, based in Squamish, just north of Vancouver. We think this is fascinating. Is this the silver bullet? No, definitely not. But this, technologies like this may well have a role to play. It has the opportunity to provide large-scale negative emissions by removing CO2 from the atmosphere at a time that we know that we probably need to, as part of the recommendations of recent IPCC reports. At the moment, the cost of capture is probably more expensive than some of the numbers that we see in carbon capture and storage and CCS, and that's for a number of different reasons. But this works in jurisdictions like the low carbon fuel standard, for example, in California. We know that over time, synthetic carbon neutral fuels, which this technology also has working with it, might be in demand for hard to abate sectors like the aviation sector, for example. So we think these types of technologies need to be given a bit of life and a bit of breath, alongside a whole range of other technologies, of course, to see if they, in fact, will play a significant role going forward. We're excited that this might do that. Nothing's guaranteed, but we continue to pay very close attention to that equity position and look forward to seeing what might come of it in the future. I guess sticking to the technology theme, we ship a lot of material. So a lot of our iron ore, a lot of our metallurgical coal, all of our copper products are distributed globally, and that means they get put on ships. So the International Maritime Organization translated the Paris Agreement into a roadmap for shipping emissions effectively. 2020, 2030, 2050. By 2050, zero carbon fuels, 70% reduction per unit of transport, and a 50% total emissions reduction. So our group, our Maritime Group, we have a Maritime Group based out of Singapore, sought to operationalise some of those recommendations. Benchmarking and vessel selection criteria, LNG-fueled vessel chartering, and second-generation biofuels at this point, to understand what roles they could play in the way that we move material around by ship. And since 2017, we have not accepted any G or F rated vessels. Now, I'm not an expert on shipping. I'm going to disappoint you here by not being able to tell you the exact difference between an F and a G. But if anybody is interested, I'm more than happy to find that information out. What we do know is that less than 2% of the vets that we undertake were not accepted on a greenhouse gas rating, and we also know that less than 10% of the very large Cape-sized vehicles that we use are F and G, and so this is only a very small minority of the vessels that we use, but it's important that we set this benchmark now. Just a quick case study here. I don't need to go into details on this, but a couple of examples here about things that we have done in selecting or deselecting ships to move material around, and we can see that the savings on these voyages, 415 tonnes, 170 tonnes in the two examples, are material, and certainly on a percentage basis material, to the emissions associated with that piece of transport. RightShip is an organisation that BHP has a very, very significant involvement in. We've launched an extensive hydrodynamic retrofitting investigation with RightShip. It's an independent organisation. Upgrades resulted in a 5 to 9% improvement in performance for the recommendations made, and one vessel that we were working with improved from an F to a D vessel. So I guess I'll just provide this to say that what we're seeking to do is have influence beyond our own operations in these types of initiatives, and to try and set a standard, along with others increasingly, to drive improvements in what is an important economic activity within our business, but also an important emissions activity within our business that we think can be improved. Mitigation for us is also about how we think about forests, how we think about carbon offsets. And for a number of years now, the business has invested and contributed significant funds towards the development of REDD+ projects, so reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation under the UNFCCC's framework. Some very, very good examples there, I think, of world-class projects, one in Peru, one in Kenya, that through unique characteristics of their own are making a contribution to the global learning experience around forest management and offset production as well. This is work that we've done with Conservation International over a number of years. The Altameo project and the Forest Bond listing, which is our REDD+ project in Kenya in 2016, are both very relevant pieces for this discussion. But you can see the work, and again, emphasising the partnerships that we have formed with groups like Conservation International, have really helped us to deliver on a broader set of environmental and biodiversity outcomes, including coastal reserve projects in Chile in 2013, and an adaptation response in a local community in Trinidad and Tobago, actually in 2015, working again with Conservation International, a very, very valued and strong partner of ours. Just a quick map of the work that we're doing in this space. There's more work to do. I think this is a very exciting area for us to work in. You know, we do see for ourselves a role, both as a company but also through our charitable foundation, to prioritise conservation outcomes in areas where that's relevant. And some of the examples there, particularly in Valdivia in Chile, is a very, very good example, a very large 50,000 hectare area of pristine conservation area that we're very, very proud to be associated with. I've just noticed the time, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide here, but this is an opportunity that we've identified for ourselves to communicate outcomes of the work we've done in the REDD+ space. So working with Conservation International and Baker McKenzie, seeking to communicate innovative financial mechanisms that others can then pick up to take REDD+ projects forward. REDD+ is only a few years ago was a fairly nascent approach and strategy to offset production and generation. And what that meant is that as we've gone through our experience, we've had to be innovative ourselves in the way that we have financed these projects, the way that we have worked with institutions like the International Finance Corporation with our project in Kenya, and finding ways to work with them where we hadn't had as significant involvement with the IFC in the past, provided us with certain lessons and outcomes. And we're very, very keen through our Finance for Forests initiative to get those lessons learned out to a whole range of other stakeholders. So up until now, I've talked about how we reduce our emissions and how we work in partnership to deploy low emissions technologies. The next section is around adapting to the physical impacts of climate change. We know that they are already happening. We know that because of built-in momentum in the climate system, we're likely to see worse outcomes of climate change translated to physical impacts in the environment. The way that we deal with this from our company perspective and our community perspective is that when we build projects, we know they might last for 80 to 100 years. They are long projects, and what that means is that physical impacts of climate change, which are already happening, as I said, and expected to get worse, will have an impact on projects of that longevity. And so when we think about our planning functions, how we develop infrastructure, for example, port facilities or rail facilities, or for example, develop water-intensive processing projects in minerals processing projects, we need to think very carefully around what the physical impact of climate change might be on the characteristics of those types of projects. And so this is something that we take very seriously. We rely on the forecasts and the intelligence of others in the climate space to understand what those impacts will be regionally distributed, but it gives us an insight into how into the type of conditions that we will be operating under over coming decades. Fourth area, testing and building the resilience of our portfolio. So we've been testing the resilience of our portfolio for a number of years now, and we do that by developing forecasts, and then against that, developing a range of scenarios, and then testing our portfolio against those scenarios. And obviously to understand which scenario we are moving towards or near, or we use a range of signposts to help us understand what is becoming more dominant. Signposts might be, for example, prior to the 2015 Paris Agreement, a signpost might have been global agreement on an absolute emissions reduction target in the form of a temperature goal. Seeing that come out through the Paris Agreement was a tangible sign at the time that the global community was coming together on this issue. Now, there have been some less favourable things that have occurred since then, with either some parties choosing to leave or the Paris Agreement, or challenges in delivering targets over the target period. But we're still very supportive and speak very consistently with the outcomes of the Paris Agreement, and we believe it was an enormous step forward, and is an enormous step forward in addressing climate change globally. So the outcomes and the conclusions of the work we do on portfolio analysis tell us that our portfolio is resilient. Now, I'll get to it in a moment, but we have published this information externally, so you're welcome to see the reports that we've written. But that resilience comes from having a diverse portfolio, comes from having low-cost assets, high-quality products, strong rates of return, and the opportunity, although that's not part of the scenario analysis necessarily, to optimise the portfolio going forward. And if there's one thing that BHP has done over its history, is to change its portfolio in response to market conditions and commodity favourability. So that is something that, as a company, as all companies are and should, opportunities for future optimisation in a world with changing markets is something that we are very conscious of. The report I referred to there is a portfolio analysis report brought out in 2015, and that's available on our website, as is the report we brought out after the Paris Agreement, which sought to understand implications of the Paris Agreement, but also updated our stakeholders on the actions that we're taking and the signposts that we're seeing in the scenarios that we set. So the last action here I want to talk about here is, and I'll be quite brief on this, is enhancing the global response. So we have a very significant number of engagements that we undertake on this topic. I've just put a very small snapshot here. We published support for COP21 statement. We've signed the UNFCCC's Paris Pledge. Our CEO has recently joined the World Bank's High-Level Commission on Carbon Pricing. We report through the Climate Disclosure Project, or CDP as you probably know it, the only resources company to score an A in the last reporting year. And we had very significant involvement through our Vice President for Climate Change and Sustainability, who sat on the Data Providers Group, which is a very influential group in terms of providing and designing the guidelines of the TCFD. We feel that through the work we've done over a number of years in relation to portfolio analysis and scenario analysis, opened up the opportunity for us to contribute that knowledge into the way that the TCFD was thinking about scenarios, and we think that's an important contribution that our team was able to make into that what has now become quite a very respected set of guidelines for the corporate sector and the financial sector and some others to report their climate risks through. So I'll probably conclude there. We've got a clear position. I do think our strategy is integrated. We want to be open and transparent through all aspects of our strategy. We couldn't do this without partners, and we remain committed to being part of a global response on this topic as we go forward. So Gabriel, that's where I will stop, and I'll let you manage from here.
Thank you, Graham. Yeah, we are going to open the session. Thank you for the presentation. And we are going to open the session to questions. And maybe I will take the first to start. So as you know, I'm doing my PhD in researching about climate change adaptation in the watersheds where my institute is. So you mentioned about taking a risk-based approach for the physical impacts in the operations. But the question is about how we can design and plan for the closure stage, considering that the possible future impacts or the impacts that we have right now on climate change and the closure stage is a long-term period. So how we can use the design since the beginning, what kind of strategies of adaptation is BHP considering, and be able to use on the design of the infrastructure to be ready to have a good land restoration process.
Look, it's a very, very good question, and probably one I don't have a direct answer for. I mean, I think closure is tremendously it's just critical the way that we operate our business. I've just spent a few days actually, Gabriel, with our head of closure, who's based here in the US. We actually operate. When I say operate, we manage over 20 closed mines as a company. Yeah. And those obligations never go away unless you move that land on to another owner. So what I do know is that they have taken the recommendations that we have set as a company on planning, and they've interpreted those in their own unique circumstances around closure. And so that I can't provide much more detail around the work that they are doing with closed mines. I guess the other thing I'll add, though, is that a lot of those closed mines are legacy assets. We've had them for a long time. Yeah. The science and the strategy around adaptation is a more recent thing. And so I think your question is a very important one, because it goes to the point of what are we doing now in operating assets to prepare them for a long-term closure after they close. And I think, and this is the time we have people on site. This is a time where we have the ability to shape an operation before closure. And I think that's a really important point. I think there's a lot there to unpack, but it's a good question.
Okay, thank you. Maybe, Graham, I will appreciate if you can please stop to share your screen so we can have the video.
Sure.
So I was wondering, there is any other question, please, from the audience that we want to ask Graham?
I have one if nobody else is popping up. You said, so you're mentioning the scenarios you're testing for climate change, and then you're comparing actual measurements towards to see, maybe where things might be going.
Yeah.
Are you measuring these or testing these in different parts of the world and seeing different trends in different places?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, our signposts are globally distributed. Some are set at the global level, but others are more regional. And as you can imagine, these scenarios are not designed purely for science, purely for climate, right? These scenarios are designed for understanding the impact and resilience for our business with a range of different factors, whether they're economic growth numbers, whether it's demand for certain commodities, whether it's conflict between different countries, trade barriers. We've heard a lot about trade implications, particularly between the US and China over the last few months. It goes down to that level of detail as well. So that we have a set of climate signposts. We have a whole bunch of other signposts and indicators, for want of a better term, that start to help us understand which one of those scenarios is becoming more dominant. So yes, we have them in country, we have them at the international level.
It's Neil from Tech. I have a question, and I put it into the group chat, and you answered most of my question about partnerships, but it made me think that more and more partnerships are coming forward regarding greenhouse gas abatement, and that there's a lot of opportunity to build additional bridges. So within Tech, we put a lot of investment into Canada's Oil Sands Innovation Alliance presently, and we're starting to see some good potential come out of that. But it just seems that we could leverage collaborative organizations more than we already are.
Yeah, I think, I'm big on partnerships, Neil, absolutely. But not partnerships for partnership's sake. You know, I think we can all get stuck in a room and talk forever. What I'm really interested in doing is forming more partnerships, number one, but number two, making them really meaningful and action-oriented. And I think it's a role that we can all play through the associations that we are in to make sure that they're very much directed towards outcomes. Because you know, industry associations per se over the years have sometimes got lost on this topic, I think, a little bit. And I think there's a role, and there's some great examples of what associations have done. There are some less so. And I think, you know, to continue what is the absolutely necessary momentum in this space, we're going to need partnerships. We're going to need them to be, you know, very action oriented and to share and live the type of ambition that we all talk about. You know, to collectively deliver that, I think, is a really exciting challenge through those types of partnerships. And you're right, there are a lot more becoming available now. I think it's almost seen as business as usual to form partnerships in this space now. There is quite a bit of opportunity to work in pre-competitive spaces on the types of things that we're doing, but also genuinely. You know, competitive relationships, you know, particularly across supply chains, where I think there's that shared risk of carbon, and I think that's what excites me quite a bit. That, you know, we've got a lot of issues to resolve in this space, but I don't think certainly not that I sense, no shortage of partners to do that work with.
Yeah, it's what I found was when we set up the greenhouse gas environmental priority area, that it was challenging to get the intellectual property aspects sorted out, because unlike some other environmental imperatives, there is true technology that would be deployed to abate emissions.
Yep.
So there's a lot of the collective oil companies and the oil sands went through a lot of effort to get to a place of comfort, and that could be useful. But I agree wholeheartedly that partnerships, for the sake of partnerships, we must have tangible benefit outcomes. We got to have stuff on the ground, and that's what we're pushing for now.
Yeah, great. Good to hear.
Yeah. We have another question, Graham, from Abu. He mentioned that with this resilience process that the mining sector is doing and bringing more smart machines to the ground, that will probably reduce the job opportunities, and how to manage this. How are the plans to, is this going to reduce the jobs and the employment capacity in the industry to have these smart machines that are energy efficiency? What do you think? What's your opinion?
Yeah, look, I think it's bringing together two very important threads of the story in that question, right? And that is a response to climate change in what is becoming a highly automated industry over time. Obviously not there yet, but I think the questionnaire is right? The role of automation, the role of AI, combined with broad electrification across operations, I think will change the way that this industry looks in 20 years' time, 10 years' time, in my mind, certainly in 20 years' time. So my view would be, I think that the real implications of bringing those two really important topics of climate and AI automation together needs a lot more thought. And perhaps that's the best way to answer this question. You know, when we're thinking about automation, when we're thinking about those sorts of design, we do need to bear in mind, the positive implications that might have for climate, but also potentially the negative ones around efficiency. So, because we know that the first, a lot of the first work that businesses in the mining sector have done around automating haul trucks has actually resulted in those trucks becoming less efficient, because the systems haven't been sophisticated enough to, and certainly not as sophisticated as a human driver, to manage up down hills and going around corners in the most energy efficient way. So as we go forward, we need to bear in mind that those two things are being done to drive favourable outcomes in both of those areas. But the premise of the question is absolutely right. I think there'll be less people on our sites going forward, and that has social implications as much as anything else, which is a whole other area that I'm not qualified to talk about, really.
Yeah. Okay. Right. We have another question from Sergio. He's mentioned about water and how BHP is managing the water management or the process, and I think this goes in relation to the extreme events that climate change is going to bring. And obviously water is the topic that is very closely related to climate change. More rain or less rain, we're going to have floods, we're going to have drought, and that will affect, or the early spring thaw, that will affect our operations and the process. So, and that could generate more contamination or risk in some cases in tailings management, for example. So in general, the question on water management and the relation to the changing climate, what is the process?
Yeah, so we recently brought out our first water report, which is available on the internet and our website. It's called BHP's Water Report, fairly uncreative name, but it is worth a read because it does go into some detail around water and how we see it as inextricably linked to the issue of climate change. It's the canary in the coal mine. It's often said. It's the thing that through changing weather patterns, through changing temperature, other issues, it is one of those first responding signs to changing climate. So part of our planning is to acknowledge that high frequency of high intensity water events, which is something that we incorporate. It's always challenging to incorporate low probability, high impact events into your planning, but we certainly try to do that. But I would encourage the other questions to look at our water report. It does go into some detail around about that. Water has become a priority for us as a business because of the importance to our operations. Over time, as many other mining companies do, we think about what processing might look like without water. How can we use less water? Not just efficiency, but how can we do away with water in many cases, dry processing, etc. These are things that go through the minds of the technical teams within BHP to manage our risk on that waterfront. So we know there's a risk there. Now you either remove that risk or you find a way to manage it. I think the tailings dam issue is a very important one. A lot of our companies have tailings dams. The tragedies associated with tailings dams have been well documented, and understanding what the role of extreme water and weather events might mean for those is obviously critical.
Okay, thank you, Graham. There's anybody who has another question, please? See, maybe I will ask you one more. On the stakeholders the shareholders, we have in the industry more pressure right now for the shareholders and understand what is happening with the climate change. How in the industry with the BHP experience, how that's changed internally, the board now, the position that you have. In the past maybe 5 or 10 years, we never saw climate change director leading the process, somebody sitting on the board. Do you think what is the tendency of what we are going to see right now and in the close future?
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, 5 years ago there might have been some environmental and social governance investor groups that were talking about climate change. I think since then it has become mainstream. I think probably, particularly in the last 12 months, it's gone another level up, right? And again, how companies are dealing with this, it's been reasonably well covered in the press, around shareholder resolutions and shareholder activism and these types of things across a range of different areas, whether that's around transparency, around reporting risk, whether it's around setting targets, whether it's around influence on industry associations. There's a lot of activity in this space, and all I can really say is that companies that are publicly listed like ours have an obligation. We have an obligation to our investors to be engaged on these topics. We are engaged on these topics significantly with our investors. We seek to provide the information that by agreement is relevant to those investors. Things like the Climate Change Portfolio Analysis Report and the Views After Paris Report are good examples of that from BHP. But more than anything, I don't think these documents are the be-all and end-all for the conversation. What they are is a tool to continue the conversation with investors. Right? What do investors want to know? Let's engage in a conversation to understand the types of things that help them understand what risk can mean, what climate risk might mean, and what actions our company is taking to manage that risk. So those documents are only useful if a conversation follows from those types of things. And dialogue is such an important thing when it comes to investor stakeholders.
Okay, perfect. Rick has a question. Can you go, Rick, please?
It was very stimulating, and if one looking from the outside might tend to think that this whole thing is very much driven by politics rather than by initiatives of companies like your own. To what degree do you think efforts are being hampered at the moment by politics?
Look, I didn't catch all of your question, Rick, but I think you were talking about to what extent have we been helped or hindered by public policy and politics?
Well, politics rather than policy. Well,
okay.
I guess they're tied together, but it seems that most of what we hear about climate change is in the political sphere rather than in the practical sphere of things being done by companies like yours. And the current US situation seems worrying that they're not very interested in climate change, but perhaps I'm more encouraged by listening to what you have to say about it.
Yeah, look, I think it's an interesting point. My first point often on this is that climate change in many areas, with some very clear exceptions like the UK and possibly in parts of Europe, it's a political issue, and it's been treated as such over many years because it's one of those issues that can divide people. Right? And when you've got a divisive topic, then it's ripe, and it's open to being exploited. And I think that's one of the challenges that we have in this space. At the same time that we're seeing, less focus on climate policy in the US under the current administration, I think it's fair to say. At the same time as that's happening, you've got very strong proposals being made under the Green New Deal, by others in politics in the US, and so it's having an equal and opposite reaction, if you like. I think the topic itself, unfortunately, has become, certainly history tells us, that it has become divisive. And I look to the UK, for example, as an example where bipartisan support for the Climate Change Act and setting targets embedded in policy is something that receives broad support across the aisle from both sides of politics, and that allows them to invest, to move forward, to set policy. Now, that doesn't make everybody happy necessarily, but it allows for progress for the country to move forward. My desire in this is that let's get the politics of climate change off the front page of the newspaper. And to do that, I think it needs a collective understanding of what an appropriate response looks like. Now, that's not going to be that is ultimately going to be a compromise. I think ultimately, there's always going to be people on one side of the argument wanting something that's unacceptable to what's on the other side of the argument. But seeking a sort of a pragmatic but long-term and effective climate policy is something that we've been supportive of for a long time.
Yeah, if I may make one other comment. Someone mentioned earlier on about intellectual property. And if you tie that together with the collaboration that you've been talking about, it reminds me that here in Canada, the acid drainage problem that plagued the mining industry 25 years ago became very prominent. It was realized after several years that the best way to solve this was by industry, governments, research organizations, universities coming together in a collaborative way to solve this. And certainly there's room, I think, in forgetting about the intellectual property. The issue here is so great that coming together to solve a common problem, I think, is the way we should be looking.
Yeah, no, it's a good example. I think, I mean, I'd be interested to think about how, corollaries between the acid mine drainage example you provided and climate. I think, climate and response to climate is so integrated into almost everything that our sector does, right? Whether it's cost of energy coming through the door, whether it's commodities that we sell, with the partners that we work with in our supply chain. Climate is an economic issue, networked right through all of that. And so it may present some unique challenges that acid mine drainage doesn't. But look, having said that, I'm just speaking off the top of my head there. I think the acid mine drainage issue was something that was prevalent across a number of different operations that had a material impact. It would have on financial performance. So it's a really interesting parallel. But the thing I take away from even that example is that this area, and if not all of it, then certainly large parts of it, is ready for collaboration in my mind.
Yeah. Anyway, well done, Graham.
Okay. Cheers.
Thank you, Graham. And for sure, I think it will be very good if you can come next year for the CIM convention and have a workshop with us and a presentation. That will be very, very good, Graham, if you can do that. So I will send you later an invitation to plan this for the next year.
Great, thank you.
Change and what we're doing in the mining sector and look for this collaborative process and to share the knowledge. And I think it's very important for sure. So I encourage to use the link. Karen just shared the link for when the presentation is going to be available for all, and you can could visit the Society of Environmental Social Responsibility Society for CIM. And I encourage those attendees that are not members right now for the society to be in touch and try to be as a member, because we have webinars each 2 or 3 months, and we want to share these ideas. For now, I think we don't have any more questions right now. So I think I want to say thank you again, Graham, for your great presentation. Thank you for all the friends to be here, and have a good day. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Gabriel. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
You want to mention something more at the end?
No, I'm good.
Very good. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.